Wow, lots of mummies.
The smell is horrible.
And making discoveries that could rewrite ancient history.
For centuries, the tomb lay sealed, hidden beneath layers of stone and silence. No one knew what waited inside, only that it belonged to one of Egypt's most powerful high priests. When archaeologists finally pried it open, they expected relics of devotion and fragments of history. Instead, they were confronted with something they could not have imagined.
Now, this is not normal in the period of ancient Egypt because typically the god kings were very masculinized.
Each step deeper into the tomb revealed evidence of a world built on control, secrecy, and fear.
This here is a king list drawn up during the reign of Ramesses II, and it represents an official listing of the kings of Egypt from the unification down to his time.
By the time they reached the final chamber, it was clear this was no ordinary burial. What they uncovered would disturb even the most hardened experts. But first, who exactly are the high priests of Egypt?
So sometimes when we are doing all this analysis with the mummies, when you're taking out the samples, we also think about what are these mummies? Who were these mummies? What lives they lived? How was their life? How did they think? How did they feel?
What high priest actually meant. In ancient Egypt, the title of high priest was not simply a spiritual position. It was a role that carried political authority and economic influence that could rival even the power of the pharaoh. The high priest was the central figure controlling every aspect of the temple, which functioned like a self-contained state. Land, labor, resources, and religious practice all fell under his direct supervision. This meant that his decisions could affect entire regions, making him one of the most powerful figures in the kingdom. The wealth of the temple was immense, and it flowed directly through the hands of the high priest.
It really was the Golden Age, the largest expansion, the greatest wealth, the high point of Egyptian civilization.
Temple estates included fertile farmlands along the Nile, orchards on higher ground, herds of cattle, and flocks of birds. These lands produced grain, fruits, meat, and other goods that were stored in vast temple storehouses. The high priest decided how this surplus was distributed. Grain could be used to feed temple workers, traded for foreign materials, or lent to farmers, who were required to repay after the annual flood season. Every harvest and distribution was carefully monitored by scribes, but the final authority rested with the high priest himself. Over time, these temples evolved beyond religious centers and became the financial hubs of their regions. Under the high priest's direction, temples issued loans to farmers and merchants. They tracked debts, set interest rates, and managed collateral. Even royal projects relied on these temple networks. When a new monument or palace was to be built, the pharaoh's officials turned to the high priest for the labor force and resources needed to complete it. This dependence gave the high priest tremendous leverage in political matters because even the royal court relied on his approval to access essential supplies. Because this role brought so much influence, it was fiercely protected within certain families. Positions of high priests were often inherited, passing from father to son or secured through strategic marriages between priestly dynasties. These families built lasting networks of power that could survive changes in the throne or royal policies. Historical records reveal that high priests mediated land disputes, decided water rights, and even imposed fines. In many cases, the temple acted as both courthouse and bank, with the high priest standing at the top of the system as the ultimate authority. If a man could command so much in life, what would he choose to take with him into his tomb? What truths might he want to protect so completely that they would remain hidden for centuries? With these questions in mind, archaeologists turned their focus from ancient documents to the physical structure of the tomb believed to contain a high priest. The sealed door and the oath. The first obstacle the archaeologists faced was not a coffin or ancient treasure, but a door unlike anything they had ever encountered. It was more than a simple barrier of stone. It was a masterpiece of ancient engineering, designed with one purpose: to keep whatever was inside hidden and preserved for thousands of years.
Just look at this place. I mean, everything is truly on a magnificent scale.
The very sight of it unsettled the team. Its surface was coated with layers of clay and plaster that had hardened until they seemed fused into the surrounding walls. Even before a single tool touched it, everyone understood this was no ordinary entrance. Ancient Egyptians knew that time was the enemy of preservation. Fragile materials such as papyrus scrolls, resins, and burial textiles could crumble to dust the moment they were exposed to air or moisture. To protect them, tomb builders used multiple sealing techniques. Each layer served a different purpose. Clay and resin locked out humidity. Plaster reinforced the structure and created a sterile environment within. Over centuries, these seals became as hard as rock, turning the doorway itself into part of the tomb's architecture. Breaking through it would not only take immense care, but also carried the risk of destroying priceless evidence in seconds. As they studied the surface closely, the team began to notice impressions pressed into the outermost layer of clay. These were not random markings. They were administrative seals bearing names, titles, and offices. Each stamp represented the official who had approved or overseen the burial process. For archaeologists, these seals were like signatures from the ancient world, offering a trail of information about the temple and political factions responsible for this high priest's interment. The door itself was now an artifact, carrying history even before anyone stepped inside. The decision to open it was not taken lightly. The team understood that a single mistake could trigger irreversible damage. According to reports from other excavations, some sealed tombs had released trapped fumes from ancient embalming fluids or resins when opened. There were even unverified accounts of toxic substances or primitive poisons being left deliberately to deter grave robbers. No one could predict what would be waiting behind this barrier. Every member of the team had to sign formal agreements before work began. When the first small crack finally appeared, the atmosphere in the chamber shifted. The air grew heavy and stale. Several archaeologists later admitted that their hearts were pounding so hard they could hear the blood rushing in their ears. The smell that escaped was sharp and sour, clinging to their throats. A few team members exchanged uneasy glances, while others whispered their doubts about continuing. One researcher even suggested abandoning the effort entirely, fearing what might happen if they went further. But the decision had been made. With painstaking precision, they continued to chip away at the hardened layers. Every inch gained felt like crossing into forbidden territory. By the time the final fragments gave way, the room was silent, except for the rasp of breathing and the faint creak of ancient stone. The doorway had done its job for centuries, guarding whatever was inside not just from robbers, but from history itself. The room that talks. When the sealed doorway finally gave way, the archaeologists expected to find a solemn resting place filled with burial goods and offerings. Instead, they entered a room that felt more like a private archive than a tomb. The space was organized and deliberate, as though it had been designed to record a legacy rather than simply protect a body. Every wall, corner, and even sections of the floor were covered in hieroglyphs.
They found paintings of the pharaohs, their gods, and their mummies everywhere.
The chamber was not silent. It spoke through its inscriptions, its layout, and its objects. In ancient Egypt, burials were meant to preserve memory. Names and titles ensured that a person's identity lived on in the afterlife. What the team saw here went far beyond typical practice. The inscriptions were not limited to prayers or blessings. They were declarations of authority. Expected titles like High Priest of the God appeared frequently, but alongside them were secular positions such as Overseer of Scribes, Controller of Granaries, and Chief of the Treasury. These were not religious roles alone. They showed that this high priest's power extended across administration, trade, and resources. He had ruled not only the temple's spiritual life, but also its economic and political systems. Teams of epigraphers began tracing long strings of names that connected to these titles. These name strings listed individuals who worked under the high priest, including junior officials, patrons, and scribes. Some strings abruptly ended where a name had been carefully chiseled out and covered with plaster. Experts proposed two possibilities. One was that these names belonged to rivals who fell from favor and were deliberately erased to destroy their memory. Another was that the damage came from later repairs. Regardless of the cause, the missing names suggested tension and disputes hidden beneath the carefully presented image of order. One wall contained a particularly unusual inscription.
These beautiful stones were left here by men who were clearly on a mission. They didn't come to steal the stones, just to remove whatever was written on some of them.
Its lines were written in alternating red and black ink with brief notes next to certain names. According to the specialists on site, this might have been a roster of appointments and dismissals, documenting which officials were active, removed, or replaced over time. If correct, this wall represented a kind of political record, showing how temple power shifted and was managed under the high priest's supervision. As the team studied these records, a troubling realization grew. The inscriptions seemed highly selective. Some details were highlighted, while others were omitted or altered. It was as if the chamber had been constructed to tell a carefully controlled story. Nothing felt accidental. The room was not just preserving history, it was shaping it, controlling how future generations would understand this man and his rule. The researchers left that chamber deeply unsettled. If even the walls were hiding parts of the truth, they wondered what darker realities still waited deeper inside the tomb. The Black Sea.
Now, regardless of what we might believe about the Exodus pharaoh, we should hear the story of this discovery.
The inner chamber placed all attention on the coffin. Its surface was buried beneath a thick black skin that caught the work lights and shone in uneven waves. The coating looked wet, even though it had hardened long ago. Several team members stepped back without speaking. The smell reached them before the samples did. Close inspection revealed that this strange layer had not formed naturally. Drips had run down the sides and frozen in place, and along the base the black substance had pooled into ridges where excess material collected. In some areas, fine brush marks could be seen, while in others, it looked as though the mixture had been poured directly over the coffin. The sticky texture clung to gloves and left dark smears on every tool that touched it. One conservator briefly lifted her mask to identify the smell, only to quickly replace it, describing the odor as pine mixed with smoke and something bitter that left a sting in her throat. Sampling began with the smallest, most cautious cuts. Technicians scraped tiny shavings from a hidden seam and the edge of the base, sealing them immediately to prevent contamination. Everyone worked in near silence, speaking only in whispers. The fear was clear and simple. If they mishandled the process, heat or exposure to fresh air could destroy evidence or permanently alter whatever this substance had preserved. The first round of analysis provided confirmation. This black coating was not the result of decay. It was deliberately created and carefully applied in distinct layers. Under magnification, the team saw a precise stratification, like stacked sheets, which indicated that the coffin had been sealed multiple times in separate sessions. Some of the inner layers contained minute flecks of charcoal, suggesting they had been warmed before being spread, a method that allowed the material to flow smoothly across the wood. Further chemical testing connected the results directly to the coffin itself. Pistacia resin was identified as one of the key ingredients. This resin was highly valued in ancient Egypt for its aromatic scent and its role in preserving organic material. Cedar oil was also detected, an import that revealed trade connections reaching far beyond the burial site. Most surprising of all was the presence of bitumen, a petroleum-derived substance used in antiquity to block moisture and air completely. This combination of materials did not resemble a random mixture. It was a sophisticated formula, likely perfected by embalmers through years of practice. The sheer amount of this compound stunned the researchers. Its thickness and volume were far greater than anything normally seen, even in the burials of elite figures. Some experts began to suspect that this process might not have been performed for a single individual. Instead, they theorized it could reflect a larger, almost industrial operation run by the temple under the high priest's command. Others disagreed, suggesting it was simply a display of wealth and power meant to set this coffin apart. As they discussed these possibilities, a new question arose. Was the coating purely protective, or was it hiding something beneath its glossy surface? One conservator suggested it could have been used to conceal inscriptions or joins, perhaps even to cover up a modification that no one was meant to see. This idea unsettled the team, and several members fell silent at the thought. The coating had done its work. It was preserved and concealed for centuries. Yet it was only part of the puzzle. Along one side of the chamber, a row of ceramic jars sat waiting. What the researchers would discover inside would push the investigation into even darker territory. The Forbidden Kit. The jars were deeply important in ancient Egyptian burial practices. They were believed to safeguard the organs and spiritual essence of the deceased, ensuring safe passage into the afterlife. Their presence signified careful preparation and respect for the dead, making them essential in both ritual and belief.
We found one of the canopic jars. It's from fine limestone, and even the sculpture of the faces is so good.
The jars in this chamber, however, were positioned with unsettling precision, as though their arrangement held meaning beyond mere storage. At first glance, they looked like traditional canopic jars, but as the team moved closer, the differences became obvious. Each jar was labeled with writing so detailed and specific that it stunned the researchers. These were not simple blessings or prayers. They were technical instructions written in hieratic script. The inscriptions identified organs such as the head, liver, lungs, and stomach, but they also included instructions for treating the wrappings and skin. Some of the words carried disturbing action verbs, like for shrinking the flesh, or to soften the bandage. This level of detail suggested a systematic and scientific approach to embalming rather than a purely religious ritual. It was as if the jars had been part of a controlled process, carefully managed, step by step. When the researchers opened a few jars, they found traces of dried residue clinging to the inner walls. Even after thousands of years, the colors were faintly visible. Laboratory analysis later identified substances such as natron and plant oils, which were expected. However, there were also compounds that defied clear explanation. Some specialists believe these mixtures may have been guarded secrets, known only to a select group within the temple hierarchy. The sheer number of jars hinted at large-scale production. This was not the preparation of a single burial. It suggested a center capable of processing many bodies with an efficiency that felt disturbingly modern. The temple may have used embalming as both a sacred service and a source of political control, deciding who was preserved and how. As the team documented their findings, an unease spread through the chamber. These jars were not only tools of preservation, they were evidence of a system where science, faith, and power were inseparable. And just beyond them, the paper mummy itself waited, wrapped in materials that would reveal a truth even harder to confront. The paper mummy. Cartonnage was a common material in ancient Egyptian burials. It was usually made by recycling old papyrus or linen, then gluing and plastering them into a hard shell to form masks or casings for mummies.
Objects to fire the imagination and start the visitor thinking of tales of ancient curses and walking mummies.
In most cases, the writing on these scraps held no importance beyond their physical use. This time, what was written on the papyrus shocked the entire team. The closer the researchers looked, the more the mummy defied expectation. Using multispectral imaging, they were able to read the ink without peeling a single layer away.
Alejandro scans ancient mummies in an Egyptian hospital.
At first, only scattered words appeared. As the scans continued, the fragments began to reveal full texts, and what they saw left the room in silence. One section listed temple accounts by month, recording grain, oil, and incense moving in and out of storerooms. Another section described debts owed by families, including penalties for failing to deliver goods after a poor flood. There were even letters filled with complaints, such as accusations of temple staff stealing offerings or using resources for personal gain. One passage disturbed the group more than any other. It described fines imposed on rival priests for holding unauthorized rites, followed by payments redirected to the high priest's own accounts. Another entry documented bulk purchases of animal offerings, treated not as spiritual gifts, but as inventory in a marketplace. The writing read like a ledger, cold and procedural, without a trace of devotion. As the texts were mapped and compared, a pattern began to emerge. Names, debts, and quotas formed a network that stretched beyond the tomb, hinting at a story much larger than a single burial. The team realized this was no longer just about one high priest's death. It felt as though they were standing on the edge of a hidden truth, one that the next chamber would force them to confront. The animal mummy industry. The team entered the final chamber with their nerves stretched tight. After the sealed doorway, the strange inscriptions, and the blackened coffin, they were bracing themselves for danger. Some whispered about curses. Others expected a hidden vault protecting the high priest's most sacred relics. Instead, the truth struck them with quiet horror. This was no shrine. It was evidence of an operation built on faith and profit. At first glance, the shelves along the walls seemed ordinary. Neatly stacked bundles of linen resembled animal mummies like those displayed in museums around the world. For centuries, pilgrims had purchased these offerings to dedicate in the name of their families, believing the mummified animals would carry prayers to the gods.
Animal mummies were very common in ancient Egypt. It probably started out quite gently with pet mummies.
The sight should have been comforting, a sign of devotion preserved through time. But as the archaeologists opened the first bundle, relief turned to shock. Inside was only a single ibis claw packed in straw. The next bundle held a few scraps of bone and feathers. A third was completely empty, just layers of linen wrapped tightly to create the illusion of weight. The deeper they looked, the more disturbing the pattern became. Many bundles contained nothing at all. Others held fragments hastily assembled, proof that these were not sacred offerings prepared with care. They were products assembled to meet overwhelming demand. Faint carvings on one wall revealed columns of numbers. According to the epigraphers, these were production logs showing how many mummies had been made in a week or month. Below them, low bins held cords cut to precise lengths, sorted feathers, and hardened lumps of resin. This was not the space of a holy ritual. It was a workshop. The temple had run an organized production line where faith itself was processed like merchandise. The strongest proof came from fragments of pottery known as ostraca. Many bore names and payment records, and some even carried complaints from pilgrims about quality or missing orders. These were receipts, unmistakable evidence of a marketplace. Worshippers had saved for years, traveling from distant regions to purchase what they believed were sacred gifts for the gods. Instead, they had been buying hollow shells, tricked into funding a system built entirely on deception. In that moment, the pieces finally connected. The black resin that coated the coffin was not a symbol of devotion at all. It was industrial, poured in staggering quantities to process and preserve bodies like goods on a shelf. The labeled jars were not sacred tools of ritual. They were instructions for a production line, detailing exactly how to treat each part of the body for maximum efficiency. Even the papyrus cartonnage wrapped around the mummy's body was no accident. Those tax rolls, donation lists, and animal mummy orders were not discarded scraps.
Animals were mummified in a variety of ways. Now, basically what mummification does is to desiccate the body.
They were the actual records of this system, recycled and bound around the very man who had overseen it. The horrifying truth struck the team. This tomb was not a sanctuary of faith. It was evidence of a calculated scheme. The high priest had turned worship into a business, selling fake offerings to desperate believers while keeping meticulous track of every payment. He had built an economy on trust and used religion as a disguise to exploit thousands of pilgrims who thought they were buying blessings. One researcher whispered through trembling lips that the most sacred object here was not a god or a prayer. It was an invoice. The high priest had not merely guided spiritual life. He had commodified it, turning devotion into profit and faith into merchandise. This chamber was the smoking gun, proving that every prayer, every sacrifice, and every act of worship had been carefully manipulated to enrich and empower a single man. The tomb had been sealed, not to protect holy relics, but to hide the machinery of exploitation that sustained his empire. As the weight of this realization settled over them, a final question arose. If this was how the temple manipulated worshippers in life, what secrets might still be hidden deeper within the tomb? Names that shouldn't exist. The final chamber appeared empty at first, just a dusty, broken space. The team expected leftover offerings or maybe administrative records. Instead, they found something far more horrifying. Buried under debris was a collection of clay figurines, all deliberately mutilated. Each one had been stabbed, shattered, or bound with cord. None were whole. None were accidental. Every act of damage was intentional, violent, and symbolic. These were not decorations. They were weapons of ritual murder, tools of ancient Egyptian curse magic. Known as execration figurines, they were designed to represent real enemies. Priests would carve names into the clay, bind them like prisoners, stab them like victims, and smash them to annihilate their spiritual presence. The destruction was an act of targeted, supernatural warfare meant to wipe people off the face of the earth, both in body and in soul. As archaeologists examined the pieces, it became clear these weren't vague or mythic threats. The inscriptions were vicious, etched in haste and hatred. There were words like, strike down, cut off.
This inscription right here, it may not look like much, but it's fascinating. Here we are, in the temple of Philae.
Erase. These weren't prayers. They were execution orders delivered through ritual, aimed directly at specific targets, like local officials, rival priests, and even whole families. These were names of people who had crossed the high priest and communities he wanted destroyed. This wasn't a moment of anger. It was a long-term system of spiritual assassination. The horror became clearer. Some of the broken figurines had dates scratched into them. Others were found next to lists of offerings. This proved that these curses weren't done once and then forgotten. They were repeated over time, on a schedule. Someone had been keeping track. The temple had a system in place, like a calendar, not just for prayers or food, but for placing and renewing curses. It was treated like any other part of temple work. Just like they counted grain or managed donations, they also kept records of who was being targeted. The temple was not just a place for faith. It was being used to carry out planned acts of revenge, and those acts were being logged, tracked, and repeated. That was the real discovery. This was not simply the resting place of a religious leader. It was clear that whoever this high priest was, he had not led by kindness or trust. He led through fear. He did not just use religion to guide people, he used it to threaten them. He used people's faith as a weapon. He built a system where belief itself could be used to destroy someone. As the team laid out the pieces, the full meaning of the chamber became impossible to ignore. All the discoveries were all part of something bigger and planned. This was not a simple tomb. It was a system built to keep control long after the high priest was dead. He wanted them broken in body, soul, and memory, and he built this room to make sure of it. This discovery forces us to rethink everything we thought we knew about Egypt's high priests. For centuries, they were seen as wise leaders, guardians of order, keepers of the god's will. But this tomb tells a much darker story. It shows that at least some of them were not peaceful guides, but ruthless operators who used faith as a weapon. For years, a few scholars warned that our understanding of ancient priesthoods might be too idealized, that beneath the rituals and monuments was something far more brutal. This discovery proves they may have been right. The high priest buried here didn't just lead prayers. He ran a system of destruction. Still, not everyone agrees with the dark interpretation. Some experts are urging caution, saying we shouldn't rush to conclusions. They believe the broken figurines and curses might not be signs of cruelty or personal revenge, but part of standard religious rituals meant to protect the community. In their view, what looks like an act of hate may have been meant as spiritual defense aimed at dangerous outsiders, not personal enemies. Without more context, they argue, we could be misunderstanding the purpose behind these objects and records. But even with those warnings, the details are hard to dismiss. All the discoveries suggest something far more personal, far more planned, and far more terrifying than a general ritual for protection.